We live in a world that has always sought explanations for thunder, death, love, order, and chaos. People have looked up to the sky, down to the earth, and into themselves, trying to make sense of what they could not control. Out of this search came belief systems, vast, intricate frameworks built to explain the unexplainable. At the core of these belief systems lie three different ways of seeing an existence: monotheism, polytheism, and atheism. One God, many gods, or none at all. These aren't just theological positions, they are reflections of how people approach reality itself, how they handle uncertainty, meaning, and fear. Monotheism, belief in a single, all-powerful deity, is often seen as humanity's intellectual evolution from the chaos of many gods, a kind of philosophical simplification. Instead of countless spirits fighting for attention, there's one supreme being who rules everything, one mind behind all creation. It offers clarity, authority, and moral order, but it also introduces a profound problem. If there's only one God and that God controls everything, then every tragedy, disease, and injustice is also part of that divine plan. Polytheism, in contrast, reflects the earlier stage of human imagination. It mirrors the world as people experienced it, full of conflicting forces, storms and sunlight, fertility and death, wisdom and war. It was a kind of spiritual democracy where no single god held the monopoly on power. The Greeks, Hindus, Norse, and Egyptians all built their own cosmic hierarchies, and these pantheons made sense to people who lived in unpredictable worlds. And then there's atheism, not as the absence of belief, but as the recognition that no claim of divine power has ever met the burden of evidence. It's not disbelief for its own sake. It's the stance that says extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, and until such proof appears, it's more honest to admit we don't know. What's interesting is how these three perspectives often coexist, even within individuals. People might reject old gods, but still talk about the universe having a plan, or fate guiding them. They may not use religious language, but the psychological pattern remains. The desire to believe there's someone keeping score. When early humans faced the terror of death, belief served a practical function. It reduced anxiety. A thunderstorm was no longer random chaos. It was the anger of Zeus. A plague wasn't meaningless suffering. It was punishment or purification. The moment an event has a story, it becomes less frightening. In that sense, belief wasn't just theology, it was therapy, but therapy can become dependency. Over time, what began as a coping mechanism evolved into dogma. The stories hardened into sacred texts. Myths turned into law. And eventually, questions became heresy. Monotheism amplified this tendency. When there's only one God, there's only one truth, and those who doubt it are not merely wrong, they're sinful. Polytheism had room for variety. You could pray to one God and ignore another. You could acknowledge contradictions without panic, but the monotheistic worldview brought total certainty, and with it, total conflict. One God means one correct path, and which means everyone else must be mistaken. That idea has shaped entire civilizations. The wars of religion, the inquisitions, the schisms, they all stem from the logic of exclusivity. When divine truth is singular, disagreement becomes rebellion against the very structure of reality. Still, monotheism offered something people deeply wanted: moral direction. It turned chaos into order, suffering into purpose. Everything happens for a reason became the most comforting and the most dangerous phrase in the human language. If a child dies, there must be a reason. If a tyrant wins, there must be a plan. It transforms pain into design, but it also dulls empathy and responsibility, because if everything is preordained, then nothing is truly unjust, only mysterious. Polytheism, for all its color and confusion, didn't try to moralize the universe in the same way. It was content with a world that was complicated and often unfair. Gods fought, cheated, and made mistakes. They were reflections of human nature, not as judges. That humility, oddly enough, made it more human. In modern times, many people no longer pray to Zeus or Odin, but the same structure reappears in subtler forms. The belief that the universe gives you what you deserve is functionally identical to divine justice. It's a comforting idea that life is fair if you play by some invisible rule book, but the data says otherwise. The world rewards luck far more often than virtue. Success and failure are distributed almost randomly. Some of the kindest people die young, some of the cruelest live long and prosper. If there's justice in this pattern, it's well hidden, and that brings us to atheism, not as an ideology, but as a recognition of reality's indifference. The universe doesn't owe us fairness. It doesn't listen, forgive, or punish. It simply operates. And within that neutrality, humans have to build meaning for themselves. For many, that's terrifying. For others, it's liberating, because once you accept that no cosmic parent is watching, you start to see moral responsibility for what it really is, not obedience to authority, but empathy between conscious beings. Morality doesn't require surveillance from the sky. It arises from the simple fact that suffering is real and shared. You don't need commandments to know that cruelty hurts, that kindness helps. These truths don't depend on belief. They depend on awareness. Still, people cling to belief systems because uncertainty is unbearable. The unknown feels like a threat to survival. So even today, when science has explained lightning, disease, and the origin of species, many still search for a guiding presence, because knowledge removes mystery but not loneliness. The shift from polytheism to monotheism, and from monotheism to secular thinking, isn't a smooth progression. It's an ongoing tension between the need for meaning and the courage to live without illusion. Every religion begins as a response to fear. Fear of death, fear of chaos, fear of meaninglessness. Over time, that fear is transformed into ritual, hierarchy, and identity. What started as an explanation becomes an institution. People gather around shared myths, not because they know them to be true, but because they need them to be true. That's why belief endures, even when evidence doesn't. Once a worldview becomes tied to identity, reason alone rarely changes it. You can present all the facts you want, but if the belief gives someone belonging, comfort, and hope, it's not just a theory, it's home. And no one easily abandons home, even when the walls are made of illusion. Monotheism took this emotional architecture and strengthened it. It created not just gods, but nations of believers. One God soon became one chosen people, and from there, one true religion. The structure of political power mirrored the structure of divine authority. Kings ruled because God willed it. Laws were moral because Scripture said so. And those who questioned either were seen as threats to both heaven and earth. But if you look closer, you can see how this system serves power as much as it serves faith. A single God allows a single hierarchy, a single voice at the top interpreting divine will. The priest, the ruler, the prophet, they all speak for the same invisible authority. That kind of centralization gives coherence to a society, but it also gives control. And once power becomes sacred, dissent becomes sin. Polytheistic societies, for all their superstition, often allowed more intellectual flexibility. They didn't always demand universal conformity. You could question one God while praising another. You could blend traditions, borrow stories, reinterpret symbols. Monotheism, by contrast, draws sharper lines. Believer and infidel, saved and damned, inside and outside. It simplifies reality until everything becomes binary. This binary view, this division of the world into sacred and profane, seeps into everyday thought. It shapes politics, ethics, even science. When you believe that ultimate truth is revealed rather than discovered, curiosity becomes dangerous. You stop asking questions because you already have the answers. But curiosity is the foundation of progress. The great revolutions in knowledge, astronomy, biology, physics, psychology, were acts of intellectual rebellion. Each one chipped away at the idea that the universe was designed with us in mind. Each one made the divine retreat further into abstraction. Once gods ruled the sky, then they ruled the mountaintops, and then the gaps in our knowledge. And now, for many, they exist mostly in metaphor. God is love, God is consciousness, God is everything, vague, elastic definitions that can't be tested or disproved, and yet they still persist because they serve a psychological purpose. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We evolved to see intention where there may be none. It's what kept our ancestors alive. If a rustle in the grass might be a predator, assuming agency that something caused it was safer than ignoring it, that instinct remains, but now it applies to the universe itself. When people say everything happens for a reason, they're expressing that ancient bias, the tendency to link events to purpose. It feels unnatural to accept randomness. Yet randomness is what we see everywhere we look, from the quantum level to the cosmic. Still, our minds crave story. The monotheist offers a single author behind all events. The polytheist offers a cast of characters. The atheist, or rather the one who no longer assumes divine agency, accepts that the story is written by no one, that meaning is something we write ourselves. And in that realization, there's both loss and freedom. Loss because the comforting illusion of destiny fades. Freedom because the responsibility for creating meaning returns to us. No one else decides what our lives stand for. No divine ledger keeps score. People often misunderstand this as nihilism, as if the absence of divine purpose means the absence of purpose altogether, but that's not how it works. When you remove cosmic meaning, personal meaning becomes more urgent, not less. You start to value moments precisely because they're finite. You appreciate kindness because no one's keeping track but you. In a world without divine reward, virtue becomes its own justification. You help others not to please a God, but because empathy is its own truth. You act ethically because suffering is real, not because commandments say so. This is morality built on shared reality, not revealed instruction. Still, many cling to belief systems even after they stop believing literally. They call themselves spiritual but not religious. They reject churches but embrace energy, karma, manifestation. It's the same psychological template in new clothes, the same need to feel watched by something benevolent. It's not stupidity or weakness, it's adaptation. The human brain evolved to find comfort in patterns and control and uncertainty. Religion satisfies both. It tells us the universe notices us, that life has a hidden structure that cares. Science, by contrast, tells us something less comforting but far more empowering, that meaning isn't discovered, it's made. The universe doesn't owe us significance, but it gives us the raw material to create it. Atoms, minds, time. When you look at the world through that lens, you start to see the deep irony. The very curiosity that religion once tried to suppress is what allowed humanity to transcend its fear. The telescope replaced the temple not by erasing wonder, but by expanding it. And yet, the old stories don't die easily. They're encoded into culture, into childhood, into language itself. Every thank God, every bless you, every holiday. They persist as cultural fossils, remnants of a time when the sky was full of voices. In a sense, polytheism never really disappeared. It was absorbed. Modern culture has simply changed the names. We worship success, fame, ideology, and nationhood with the same fervor once reserved for gods. We offer our time and devotion to symbols that promise transcendence. The difference is that today, the altars are screens, not temples, and the priests are algorithms. But the structure, faith, ritual, devotion, remains familiar. It's a reminder that belief is not just a set of doctrines, but a human impulse, an evolutionary habit that still shapes the modern mind. The question then becomes, can humanity ever truly outgrow belief, or will it simply keep reinventing it in new forms? Even when gods fade, the mechanisms of belief remain. People still search for ultimate meaning, something absolute to anchor their identity and values. It might be ideology, nationalism, moral purity, or even the cult of self-optimization. Each promises the same emotional reward that religion once did: certainty, belonging, and moral clarity. Monotheism and polytheism may have shaped ancient civilizations, but their logic still pulses beneath modern thought. The idea that there must be one ultimate truth, or many competing powers, is alive in our politics, our philosophies, and even our technology. In one worldview, truth is singular and absolute. In the other, it's fragmented and relative. The tension between the two continues to define us. Atheism, or more precisely the absence of supernatural belief, isn't a doctrine that fills that space. It's the space itself, the clearing after the storm. It doesn't replace gods with new ones. It asks whether we need any at all. That's a harder question than it sounds, because even when people intellectually reject religion, emotionally they often still long for what religion provided: community, continuity, narrative. It's not enough to remove belief. Something has to replace its function. That's where art, philosophy, and science step in. Art gives us emotional connection without demanding obedience. It's how we explore meaning, morality, and transcendence without pretending they come from beyond us. A painting or a song can move us to tears, not because it's divine, but because it speaks the language of experience. Philosophy gives structure to our ethics. It asks not what does God want, but what kind of world do we want to create me? It replaces commandments with reasoning, revelation with reflection, and science, often misunderstood as cold or clinical, actually deepens our sense of awe. It shows us a universe far more intricate and mysterious than any scripture ever imagined. It's not a loss of wonder, but a redefinition of it. Wonder without worship, that difference is subtle, but profound. Religion often claims awe for itself, as if the only way to experience mystery is to attribute it to a deity. But mystery exists independently of belief. You don't need faith to marvel at the structure of a snowflake or the birth of a star. You only need curiosity and humility. Monotheism, by making one God responsible for everything, often ends up explaining nothing. If every event is God's will, then the word explanation loses meaning. It's a philosophical dead end. Polytheism, on the other hand, anthropomorphizes nature. It humanizes the weather, the sea, the harvest. That gave people emotional connection, but at the cost of accuracy. Atheism, or a secular understanding of reality, does something different. It doesn't pretend to know everything, but it accepts what can be known. It replaces authority with inquiry. It admits uncertainty without inventing answers. And that's what truly separates these worldviews, and not just what they believe, but how they handle the unknown. Monotheism insists the unknown is already known. Polytheism turns it into myth. Atheism keeps it open. It says, we don't know yet, but we can find out. That humility is often mistaken for arrogance. Critics say that rejecting divine authority is prideful. But what could be more humble than admitting we don't know everything? Religion claims certainty on questions no one has ever answered. Science and skepticism admit ignorance and treat that ignorance as an opportunity, not a failure. Still, there's a psychological comfort in thinking someone's in control. The idea that a divine plan exists feels safer than randomness. In times of suffering, it's easier to believe that pain has purpose than to accept that it's meaningless. That's the emotional foundation of theism. It transforms chaos into narrative. But there's another kind of comfort, one that comes from honesty. To look at tragedy and say, there's no hidden reason, it just happened. That kind of acceptance may sound bleak, but it's also freeing, because if suffering isn't part of a plan, then it's not sacred. It's something we can fight, alleviate, and prevent. When a child dies, saying it was God's will ends the conversation, and saying it was preventable begins one. One view accepts suffering, the other tries to reduce it. One sanctifies tragedy, the other seeks to understand it. Throughout history, belief in gods has often been tied to social order. It provided cohesion and control. Religion gave rulers legitimacy and followers unity. But as societies grew more complex, so did their gods. Deities became reflections of cultural priorities. Agricultural societies worshipped fertility gods, Warring states worshipped gods of conquest. Each theology mirrored the needs of its people, and when those needs change, so did the gods. That's why new religions rise and old ones fade, not because one is truer than another, but because each serves a particular psychological and social function. In the modern world, science and technology have taken over many of those functions. Medicine replaced healing rituals, meteorology replaced rain dances, space exploration replaced heaven, but the emotional habits remain. People still want belonging, still crave purpose, still seek transcendence. That's why even in secular societies you find quasi-religious movements, political ideologies, self-help cults, conspiracy groups, all with their own prophets, sacred texts, and excommunications. The form is ancient, only the content changes. It reveals something crucial. The problem isn't belief itself, but belief without evidence, conviction without accountability. The moment we stop testing our ideas against reality, they become faith. And faith, no matter how noble it sounds, is simply the refusal to doubt. Doubt is often seen as weakness, but it's actually the foundation of intellectual integrity. It's the willingness to test, to revise, to let go of what no longer fits. Without doubt, progress would be impossible. Every discovery begins with the suspicion that what we believe might be wrong. Religion, in contrast, sanctifies certainty. The highest virtue is faith, belief without evidence. The devout are praised for clinging to conviction no matter what facts emerge. That kind of thinking may comfort the individual, but it arrests collective growth. A mind that refuses to question is like a locked door. Nothing new can enter. Polytheism allowed a bit more flexibility. It didn't demand complete uniformity, but it was still built on the same premise, that the unknown must be filled with intention. The difference between Zeus threw the lightning and God controls the weather is cosmetic. Both replace inquiry with explanation by authority. But once humanity learned to measure, to predict, to replicate, once the lightning rod outperformed the prayer, that pattern began to break. We started to see cause and effect where once there had been mystery and miracle. The gap where gods once lived began to shrink. And yet, many still claim that science and faith can coexist, that they address different kinds of truth. It's a comforting idea, but not an honest one, because when those truths overlap, only one side adjusts. When evidence contradicts Scripture, Scripture bends or reinterprets. The adjustment always moves in one direction, and from revelation toward reality, never the other way around. Even theologians acknowledge this, though rarely out loud. Every modern believer lives in a world built on secular reasoning while praying to ancient symbols. They take antibiotics instead of holy water, trust GPS instead of prophecy, but still feel attached to a story written for a world that no longer exists. That attachment isn't trivial, it's emotional, cultural, ancestral. Religions don't just shape individuals, they shape civilizations. They built art, law, language. They helped organize early societies, but they also froze them. The same institutions that once united people later divided them. Monotheism especially tends to fossilize moral codes. When morality is tied to divine command, it can't evolve easily. Ancient laws written for tribes are treated as eternal truths, and that's where the conflict between tradition and progress arises. If a moral principle is said to come from an all-knowing, unchanging deity, questioning it becomes blasphemy. But human ethics do evolve. They must. What was once considered normal, slavery, divine monarchy, the subjugation of women, is now abhorrent. The shift didn't come from revelation, it came from reasoning, empathy, and experience. In that sense, morality has always been human, even when it wore divine clothing. People projected their own values onto gods, then re-imported them as commandments. When societies became more compassionate, their gods did too. When societies were cruel, their gods justified it. The pattern is unmistakable. Polytheistic religions were more honest about this projection. Their gods were openly flawed, jealous, lustful, impulsive. They embodied humanity's chaos instead of denying it. Monotheism, in contrast, tried to separate the divine from the human, but even then, the God it imagined was unmistakably human, angry,
possessive, proud. The resemblance is impossible to miss. Some argue that belief is necessary for morality, that without God, there would be no reason to be good. But history disproves that. People have done both terrible and noble things in the name of gods, and also without them. Compassion, cooperation, and justice existed before Scripture. They evolved because they were useful. Societies that practiced empathy survived better than those that didn't. Morality isn't divine. It's biological and social. It's the outcome of millions of years of evolution among creatures who needed one another to
survive, and that's why empathy appears in animals too, why we see altruism in dolphins, elephants, and primates. The seeds of ethics were planted long before religion began. When religion claims ownership of morality, it's claiming credit for something older and deeper than itself. It's like a child thinking it invented language because it learned to speak. Still, people often mistake moral conviction for divine command. They feel that something is right or wrong so deeply that it seems external, as if the universe itself agrees. But moral feelings are part of human psychology, shaped by empathy, culture, and experience. There's no evidence that they come from outside the mind. That doesn't make them less meaningful. That makes them more our responsibility. We can't hide behind divine law when we choose cruelty or indifference. We can't say God willed it when we ignore suffering. Without supernatural justification, morality becomes more personal and urgent. But that urgency can also be uncomfortable. It means there's no cosmic judge to fix what we break, no heaven to balance the scales. If the universe is indifferent, then justice is something we have to create ourselves. That's where many people recoil. The idea that meaning, purpose, and morality are human inventions feels too heavy. They want something eternal, something guaranteed. But perhaps that desire itself, that hunger for permanence, is the last echo of the old gods. The truth may be that nothing eternal exists in the way we wish it did. Stars die, civilizations fall, memories fade, and yet, in the midst of impermanence, life still creates beauty, compassion, and understanding. Meaning doesn't need eternity to be real. It only needs awareness. The fact that something ends doesn't make it worthless, it makes it precious. The moment you realize that, the need for gods begins to dissolve, because what religion promises on permanence, justice, love, can all exist in human hands, not perfectly, but genuinely. We can create art that outlives us, laws that protect the weak, friendships that heal. We don't need divine reward to justify those things. Their value is self-evident. That's the quiet strength of a world without gods. It doesn't deny mystery. It just refuses to surrender to it. Once you start to see morality and meaning as human creations, the picture of belief changes completely. Religion stops being about truth and starts being about function. And no, is it real? But what purpose does it serve? For much of history, belief systems were a way to manage societies too large to be held together by kinship alone. They provided common identity, moral coordination, and authority. When a tribe grew into a nation, faith acted as social glue. People who shared gods were less likely to kill one another, at least in theory. But that same glue hardened into walls. Once unity depended on shared belief, difference became dangerous. Monotheism, with its single truth, amplified this tendency to divide. When one god ruled, other gods couldn't coexist peacefully, and that logic repeated endlessly in crusades, jihads, inquisitions, all the way to modern ideological conflicts. Even when religion claims peace, it often does so with conditions, peace among believers, not necessarily among all people. The moral circle stops where faith ends. That's the tragedy of the divine monopoly on truth. Atheism, or rather, a secular understanding of morality, expands that circle. It sees empathy not as a gift from above, but as a shared trait among conscious beings. That shift removes hierarchy from compassion. It means an act of kindness toward a stranger, an animal, or even an enemy doesn't need divine permission. It's valuable simply because it reduces suffering. Many believers insist that without a God watching, humans would descend into chaos. But in reality, crime rates are often lowest in secular countries. Studies consistently show that societies with higher levels of education, equality, and social support, not faith, produce more ethical behavior. It's not belief that makes people good. It's well-being, understanding, and justice. That evidence challenges a long-standing myth that morality collapses without religion. If that were true, prisons would be filled with atheists. Instead, the reverse tends to be true. The correlation isn't perfect, but it's strong enough to reveal something deeper. Ethical behavior thrives where people are free to think, not where they're forced to believe. Polytheism, interestingly, understood human nature in a more grounded way. Its gods were fallible, emotional, even absurd. They made mistakes, and those mistakes explained human flaws. The divine was a mirror, not a master. Monotheism replaced that mirror with a judge, perfect, unchanging, demanding obedience. That shift produced guilt, the idea that we are all sinners, born wrong, owing apologies simply for existing. That moral framework still shapes the modern psyche. The sense that one must constantly earn forgiveness, prove worthiness, or seek redemption. Even when people leave religion, the emotional residue often remains. They trade one authority for another, the boss, the state, public opinion. But the feeling is the same. Someone higher must approve. Atheism doesn't erase that conditioning overnight. It takes time to unlearn the reflex of seeking permission to be. It's not just an intellectual process, but an emotional one. Because for many, belief wasn't about doctrine, but comfort, and that comfort matters. People often turn to religion not because they find its claims convincing, but because it offers belonging and hope. It's easier to endure hardship when you think it has meaning. It's easier to face death when you believe it's not the end. But comfort and truth aren't the same. The universe doesn't adjust itself to soothe our fears. If anything, maturity begins when we stop expecting it to, when we realize that our longing for permanence doesn't make permanence real. That realization doesn't have to be bleak. The absence of divine oversight doesn't erase meaning. It hands it back to us. We are the authors, not the audience. That's an enormous responsibility. But it's also the only kind of freedom that matters. Throughout history, moments of great human progress, the abolition of slavery, the expansion of rights, the rise of science, have come not from obedience to gods, but from defiance of them, from people daring to say, this is wrong, even if Scripture says otherwise. If morality truly depended on revelation, progress would have stopped centuries ago, but it didn't, because ethics, empathy, and reason continue to evolve while sacred texts stay frozen. When people say God is timeless, what they often mean is our moral codes must never change, but time changes everything. Not only knowledge, but compassion. The idea of justice today is radically different from what it was even a century ago. That's not moral decay, it's moral growth. And growth requires questioning, something religion traditionally fears. Faith demands loyalty to established truth. Progress demands loyalty to reality. The two are not the same. This is why societies that embrace secular values, free inquiry, evidence, debate, tend to flourish, not because they are perfect, but because they can correct themselves. In religious systems, correction is heresy. In rational systems, correction is migress. The difference may sound abstract, but it determines everything. How we handle medicine, law, rights, technology. In a dogmatic world, authority defines truth. In a secular one, truth defines authority. That's the essence of the transition from belief to understanding, from God said so to let's find out. It's not an easy transition, and for individuals raised in faith, letting go can feel like losing part of themselves. The rituals, the songs, the sense of belonging, they're woven into identity. Rejecting belief can feel like exile, but it's a strange kind of exile that leads home, because once the fear fades, what's left isn't emptiness, it's clarity. The world becomes what it always was, vast, indifferent, and beautiful beyond measure. You begin to see morality as a human art, not a divine decree. You see suffering as something to be understood, not endured for a higher purpose. You stop asking, why did this happen to me, and start asking, What can I do about it? That shift in perspective from divine submission to human agency is the quiet revolution at the heart of secular thought. It doesn't destroy meaning, it builds it from the ground up. Once agency replaces submission, the relationship between human beings and the universe changes. We stop thinking of ourselves as subjects in a cosmic monarchy and start seeing ourselves as participants in an ongoing process, not chosen, not condemned, just alive and capable of thought. That shift brings humility of a different kind. Religion teaches humility before an imagined authority. Secular understanding teaches humility before reality itself. The stars don't revolve around us. The planet doesn't exist for us. Our species is one branch on a vast evolutionary tree, fragile and temporary. Yet within that fragility, consciousness appears, and with it, wonder. The wonder isn't smaller without gods, it's purer. It no longer depends on mythology to justify itself. A sunset is not a message. It's an interaction of light and atmosphere, and it's beautiful precisely because it needs no meaning to exist. The more you understand, the more awe replaces worship. That's something many traditions misunderstand. They think mystery dies when explanation arrives. But explanation doesn't kill mystery. It transforms it. Knowing how stars form doesn't make them less miraculous. It shows that reality itself is miraculous enough. Monotheism often portrays knowledge as dangerous. The story of Eden captures that fear perfectly. The first humans are punished not for disobedience, but for curiosity, for tasting knowledge. That story has echoed through centuries of thought. The warning that understanding is a sin, that enlightenment brings exile. But if you look closely, that's not a story about morality. It's a story about control. Knowledge threatens authority because it removes the need for obedience. The more you understand, the less you fear. And without fear, you can't be ruled through myth. Polytheistic myths sometimes celebrated curiosity. Prometheus stealing fire, for example. Yet even then, the gods punished him. The message was the same. Wisdom is for the divine, not for you. Modern science rejects that hierarchy. It democratizes knowledge. The laws of physics are not secret scrolls. Anyone can study them. The universe doesn't reveal itself through prophets, but through observation. That's what makes secular thought revolutionary. It replaces revelation with participation. Still, many find this unsettling. They want mystery to mean something. They want to believe that behind the equations and galaxies, there's intention. But intention implies a mind, and a mind implies preference. Once you project preference onto the universe, you also project bias, good and evil, reward and punishment. And soon you're back to theology. Maybe the universe isn't personal. Maybe it's just vast. Maybe that's enough. In a strange way, that idea restores authenticity to human emotion. Love, grief, joy. They're no longer ripples from a divine plan, but spontaneous expressions of conscious life. That makes them smaller in scale, but greater in honesty. When you remove the idea that suffering has meaning, compassion becomes deeper. You stop explaining pain and start responding to it. You no longer say everything happens for a reason. You say, this shouldn't have happened, so let's make it better. That's morality without metaphysics, direct, human, and real. There's also intellectual freedom in letting go of divine authorship. If no God designed the universe, then we're not trapped in someone else's script. Evolution, randomness, and probability are not enemies of meaning. They are its raw materials. The patterns we create, art, language, science, empathy, are the universe becoming self-aware through us. That's not arrogance, it's participation. We are a brief spark of consciousness in a vast darkness, but that spark can illuminate a little corner of reality before it fades. That's enough. When monotheists talk about creation, they often say, God made us in his image. In a secular sense, the opposite is closer to the truth. We made gods in ours, as mirrors of our hopes, fears, and ideals. And when we learned enough about ourselves, the mirror cracked You can see this evolution in sacred texts themselves. Early gods were tribal and violent. Later ones became moral teachers. The concept of divinity evolved with civilization. More justice, less jealousy, more mercy, less rage. The divine matured as we did, until finally it began to dissolve into abstraction. God is love, God is energy, God is the universe. Statements so broad they say nothing, and it is not that believers became less sincere, it's that the concept could no longer bear the weight of knowledge. As understanding expanded, the divine retreated from the mountains to the clouds, from the clouds to heaven, from heaven to metaphor. The more we discovered, the less room there was for the supernatural. But what replaced it wasn't emptiness. It was awareness. The realization that meaning doesn't have to be given. It can be made. In that sense, atheism isn't a negation. It's a return to the raw experience of being, like stripped of illusion. When you stand beneath the night sky and feel both insignificant and connected, that's not absence of spirituality. That's its most honest form. True spirituality, if the word can be used at all, doesn't come from worship. It comes from understanding how astonishing existence is without pretending it was designed for us. Is the humility of being part of something enormous, not the arrogance of being its purpose. This view doesn't offer eternal life or divine justice. It offers something rarer, reality, the awareness that we're temporary but capable of kindness, finite but capable of beauty, alone but capable of connection. And when people say, without God, life has no meaning, what they often mean is, without a script, I don't know what to do. But that uncertainty is the beginning of authenticity, meaning that isn't handed down, must be built, and what we build is ours. That's the quiet dignity of a godless world, and not despair, but ownership. It's the recognition that if love, morality, and purpose exist at all, they exist because we create them, not because they were imposed upon us. When people finally accept that meaning is self-made, not bestowed, something subtle but profound happens. They stop waiting for the universe to justify them. They start living as though their choices matter, not eternally, but immediately. That immediacy gives life texture. If there's no afterlife to balance the scales, every act of kindness matters more. Every injustice demands action now, not divine correction later. The stakes become real because there's no one coming to fix things. In that way, the absence of gods doesn't make morality weaker. It makes it urgent. It brings the abstract down to earth. The question isn't what would God want, but what kind of world do we want to create? That shift turns ethics from obedience into empathy, from divine command into human collaboration. You can see the results of that shift wherever secular ethics takes root, in medicine that saves lives regardless of faith, in laws that protect minorities, in education that values evidence over doctrine. These things are not miracles. They are the consequences of reasoning guided by compassion instead of authority. And yet, even in modern societies, religion remains woven into identity. Many people don't believe in gods, but still feel culturally tethered to faith. They celebrate religious holidays, marry in churches, bury their dead with rituals they no longer interpret literally. It's not hypocrisy, it's nostalgia. Religion, stripped of its truth claims, becomes a language of memory. There's a certain beauty in that. Rituals can preserve emotion without enforcing belief. Lighting a candle, sharing a meal, singing together. These actions need no metaphysical justification. They are expressions of shared humanity. The danger only arises when ritual becomes rule, when culture turns into control. Polytheism once handled this balance more naturally. It allowed multiplicity of gods, of truths, of interpretations. It could evolve without self-destruction because no single claim demanded exclusivity. Monotheism, by insisting on a monopoly of truth, made adaptation harder. Its strength was unity, but its weakness was rigidity. That rigidity explains why monotheistic religions often fracture into sects. When truth is singular and absolute, any deviation feels like betrayal. So belief systems multiply through conflict, each one claiming to be the pure form of the original revelation. It's a paradox. Unity breeds division. Atheism sidesteps that paradox entirely. There's no revelation to defend, no doctrine to protect. Ideas can change because they're not sacred. The only loyalty is to evidence and reason, both of which evolve as understanding grows. That flexibility is not moral relativism, it's intellectual honesty. But honesty can be uncomfortable. It doesn't always give the answers we want. It tells us that the universe won't bend to our desires, that good people suffer and bad people thrive. Religion tries to soften that truth with promises, heaven, karma, divine balance. Secular thought faces it directly, and from that confrontation comes a different kind of strength, the ability to live without guarantees, to act ethically without reward, to love without eternity. It's a quieter, braver form of faith in reality itself. Some might call that emptiness, but it's not. It's clarity, the kind of clarity that comes when the fog of expectation lifts. When you realize the universe isn't a story written about you, you can finally see it as it is, immense, intricate, indifferent, and still breathtaking. That realization doesn't diminish humanity. It defines it. We are the species that asks why. The only creatures, as far as we know, capable of contemplating our own existence. That capacity gives rise to gods, but it also allows us to outgrow them. If you trace human history as a line of consciousness expanding outward from tribe to city to planet, you'll notice a pattern. Every step forward required breaking a sacred boundary, questioning a divine law, crossing a line someone said must never be crossed. When we learned that the Earth wasn't the center of the cosmos, it wasn't just an astronomical discovery. It was an existential one. It dethroned humanity, and yet, in doing so, it revealed a far grander reality. The same happened with evolution. Once we thought life was separate from nature, a divine exception. Then we learned we were part of it, cousins of all living things. That knowledge didn't reduce us, it connected us. It showed that meaning comes not from separation, but from continuity. Each scientific leap, from heliocentrism to genetics to cosmology, has pushed the gods further into metaphor. But each leap has also brought us closer to one another. When you realize that every atom in your body was forged in a star, the idea of divine creation seems too small to contain the truth. Still, religion persists, not because it's true, but because it fulfills emotional needs that knowledge alone can't. Humans want not just facts, but belonging. We crave stories that make us feel part of something larger. That's why even secular societies create their own mythologies, national narratives, ideological movements, collective dreams. The difference is that in a secular worldview, those myths can be recognized as myths. You can appreciate their poetry without mistaking them for literal truth. That awareness is what keeps belief from becoming tyranny. When people say humans need something to believe in, they're both right and wrong. We don't need belief in the supernatural. We need meaning, patterns we can live by. The challenge is to build those patterns consciously, knowing they are our creation, not divine decree. That's what philosophy and art attempt to do. They're the modern temples of thought and feeling. They don't promise salvation, they offer perspective. They remind us that even without gods, we can still reach for transcendence, not upward, but inward. Transcendence doesn't have to mean leaving the human condition behind. It can mean understanding it deeply enough to act with compassion and courage despite its limits. That's what makes secular life meaningful. Not certainty, but engagement. Not divine reward, but shared effort. And when you think of it that way, the ancient conflict between monotheism, polytheism, and atheism looks less like a battle of truths and more like an evolution of awareness. Each stage reflects humanity's growing relationship with its own ignorance. Polytheism gave form to chaos. Monotheism gave it order. Atheism gives it honesty. Honesty, though, has never been as seductive as certainty. People prefer a confident story over an uncertain truth. That's why belief systems endure long after their explanations collapse. They provide emotional security in a way raw reality rarely does. But certainty has a cost. When people stop doubting, they stop learning.
The conviction that truth has already been revealed turns every question into a threat. And once curiosity is a sin, ignorance becomes holy. This is the deeper difference between faith and reason, not the presence or absence of wonder, but the attitude toward correction. Reason celebrates correction as progress. Faith treats it as betrayal. The result is that faith protects comfort while reason protects truth. And truth, however uncomfortable, always wins eventually. It wins slowly, sometimes painfully, but it wins because it works. It builds airplanes that fly, vaccines that save, telescopes that see across time. No prayer ever put a rover on Mars. That doesn't mean science answers every question. Far from it. It simply refuses to pretend it already knows. It accepts uncertainty as the price of honesty. That humility is often mistaken for coldness, but it's the opposite. It's respect for reality as it is, not as we wish.
It to be polytheism once gave people an imaginative framework for the unknown. Monotheism turned that framework into law. Atheism leaves the framework open, infinite, unfinished. It doesn't close the book. It removes the author. And in that openness, something extraordinary happens. People begin to see the world not as property or punishment, but as a shared home. The absence of divine ownership turns responsibility outward toward one another. If there's no God to fix the planet, we must. That's why secular ethics and environmentalism often go hand in hand. The moment you stop believing that the earth was made for you, you start understanding how easily it can be destroyed by you. You stop waiting for apocalypse and start preventing one. Religious thought, especially monotheistic, often imagines history as a script, a beginning, middle, and end with a final judgment waiting. That narrative can make people passive. If everything is destined, then human effort changes nothing. But a secular understanding sees history as open-ended. The future isn't written, it's built. That difference isn't abstract. It shapes policy, education, and even empathy. The belief in divine justice can make people accept suffering as meaningful. The recognition of randomness makes people act to reduce it. When an earthquake hits, a believer may say, God is testing us. A rational mind says, let's improve building design. One seeks comfort and meaning. The other seeks safety and understanding. Both are human, but only one leads to progress. This doesn't mean all belief is harmful. Some forms of faith inspire art, generosity, and hope, but even those virtues don't require gods. They require imagination, the same imagination that once created deities can now create solutions. The creative impulse is neutral. It can build temples or telescopes. It's where we direct it that matters. In that sense, atheism isn't the opposite of spirituality. It's its evolution. It's the movement from worshiping mystery to engaging with it, from kneeling before the unknown to studying it. The wonder remains, the obedience fades. Still, there's a lingering fear that without belief, life loses meaning. But perhaps meaning never depended on belief, only on awareness. We don't need the universe to care about us for our lives to matter to one another. A single act of kindness carries more moral weight than any prayer. When people say, without God everything is permitted, they misunderstand both morality and freedom. Without gods, nothing is forgiven automatically. Responsibility becomes heavier, not lighter. Every action belongs entirely to the doer. You can't outsource guilt to sin or virtue to grace. That's not moral chaos, that's moral adulthood. And moral adulthood is hard. It means facing your mistakes without cosmic absolution, and it means forgiving others without divine instruction. It means living ethically because it's right, not because you're being watched. That's why this perspective can seem austere, because it removes the comfort of a perfect overseer, but it replaces it with something truer, the understanding that goodness matters precisely because it's fragile. Compassion is precious because it's not guaranteed by the universe. Once you accept that, life becomes richer, not emptier. Every joy, every act of love, every creative moment becomes finite and therefore sacred in its own way. Not sacred because it's divine, but because it's real. And that reality, when fully faced, has its own kind of transcendence. The kind that doesn't separate us from the world, but binds us to it. The kind that doesn't ask for worship, but for awareness. Monotheism offered a single truth. Polytheism offered many stories. Atheism offers a conversation, endless, self-correcting, shared. It replaces revelation with dialogue. It turns the search for truth into a collective effort rather than a divine gift. And that collective search is what gives humanity its meaning. The universe may not care, but we do, and that's enough. Our empathy, our curiosity, our creativity, these are not accidents. They're the highest expressions of life. So when people ask, what replaces God? When the answer is simple, nothing replaces God because nothing needs to. The space once occupied by God's isn't empty, it's filled with us and thinking, learning, and building meaning together. And perhaps that's what all those ancient myths were reaching for without realizing it. Not a sky full of gods, but a world full of minds capable of understanding themselves. When you strip away the language, symbols, and centuries of interpretation, that's what belief has always been about. The human mind trying to recognize itself in the vastness. Each version of God, from the storm spirits to the monotheistic creator, was a mirror for consciousness. We were sketching our reflection on the sky. Polytheism expressed our complexity, our passions, our contradictions. Monotheism reflected our longing for order, our need for a single narrative to hold the chaos together. And atheism reflects our growing maturity, the willingness to live without illusion, to find beauty without storytelling. That's not arrogance. It's acceptance. The acceptance that reality doesn't owe us comfort, that we are temporary but capable of awareness, and that awareness is enough to justify existence. In that sense, atheism isn't about denying gods, it's about refusing to shrink the universe to human scale. It's the understanding that reality is richer when we stop forcing it into our image. The absence of divine intention doesn't make life meaningless. It makes it free. Freedom, however, is heavier than faith. Belief tells you what's true and what's good. Freedom demands that you decide, that decision-making is messy. It involves uncertainty, disagreement, mistakes. But it's also the source of every creative and moral breakthrough humanity has ever achieved. The societies that learned to tolerate doubt, to live with disagreement, became centers of progress. The ones that demanded uniform belief stagnated. That pattern is visible across time. The flourishing of science and democratic cultures isn't coincidence. It's the result of permission, the permission to question. Monotheism promised moral certainty, but often delivered moral paralysis. When people think right and wrong are fixed by divine decree, they stop evaluating them. Ethics becomes obedience rather than reflection. A God may tell you not to kill, but only reason can explain why that command matters. And reason's explanation is stronger, not weaker. It's rooted in empathy, reciprocity, and awareness of suffering. Those are not holy ideas. They're observable realities. When someone is in pain, you can see it, measure it, reduce it. That's morality without mythology. Grounded in shared experience rather than faith, this kind of morality also evolves naturally. The more connected people become through travel, communication, technology, the larger their moral circle grows. It's not revelation that makes people care about distant strangers. It's understanding. When you can see another's life in detail, belief fades, but empathy deepens. That expansion of empathy is one of humanity's greatest achievements. It's what allows us to care for animals, for ecosystems, for future generations we'll never meet. None of that requires divine command. It requires imagination, the ability to see yourself in another's place. That same imagination once created gods. Now it creates compassion. The same psychological tools that produce myth can produce morality. The same instinct that once looked for a higher power can now be directed toward understanding and cooperation. That's evolution, not just of biology, but of thought. The move from explaining the world through stories to exploring it through evidence. From being ruled by mystery to being inspired by it. But even as humanity grows in knowledge, belief doesn't vanish overnight. It lingers in habits, in language, in yearning. People still speak of fate, karma, the universe listening. The structure of belief remains even when the gods are gone.
Maybe that's inevitable. Evolution doesn't erase old instincts, it repurposes them. The same tendency to anthropomorphize, to see agency everywhere, that once created deities now shapes conspiracy theories, political cults, and celebrity worship. The need for belonging, the comfort of certainty, these remain
Powerful forces, and that's why critical thinking is a skill, not a default. It has to be taught, practiced, defended, because without it, the human mind slips easily back into myth. But critical thinking doesn't have to kill meaning, it just changes its source. Instead of being handed down, meaning becomes something you craft, like art or science, a work in progress. That's what gives secular life its depth. Every insight, every act of creation, every moral improvement is part of that ongoing work. And perhaps that's the most hopeful thing about abandoning gods. It doesn't end the search for meaning, it democratizes it. Everyone gets to participate, no one holds exclusive truth. We're all collaborators in the same experiment. The question, why are we here, becomes, what can we do while we're here? And that change, simple as it sounds, transforms everything. It turns existence from a test into an opportunity. You start to realize that the only afterlife that matters is the impact you leave behind, the ideas you contribute, the kindness you pass on, the lives you improve, not because you'll be rewarded, but because those things ripple forward long after you're gone. Legacy replaces eternity. Connection replaces salvation. Truth replaces faith. None of it lasts forever, not even humanity itself, but that doesn't make it meaningless. A song doesn't need to be infinite to be beautiful. A life doesn't need to be eternal to be worthwhile. That's the difference between myth and meaning. Myths promise permanence. Meaning accepts impermanence and loves anyway. In that love, of knowledge, of beauty, of others, lies the true continuity of existence. It's not divine, it's deeply human. And so the story that began with many gods, then one god, and finally none, isn't a story of loss. It's a story of growing up, of trading comforting illusions for difficult truths, and discovering that those truths are enough. The story of belief, in the end, is the story of humanity's dialogue with its own reflection. For thousands of years, we've spoken to the sky, to the sea, to invisible powers, not realizing that we were speaking to ourselves. We created gods to answer the questions we were too frightened to face alone, and then spent centuries mistaking the echo for a voice from beyond. But now we know the echo for what it is, the sound of thought in an empty universe. And that emptiness isn't despairing. It's open. It's the canvas on which meaning is drawn. When you remove divine oversight, the world doesn't collapse, it expands. Responsibility replaces fate. Curiosity replaces obedience. Compassion replaces commandments. The universe stops being a story and becomes a reality we share. Monotheism tried to compress that reality into a single will, one truth, one law, one narrative, and it gave coherence, but at the cost of freedom. Polytheism scattered that coherence into thousands of symbols, diverse, poetic, but bound to myth. Atheism, in contrast, lets the universe stand on its own. It says reality doesn't need permission to exist. That view might seem cold, but it's not. It's simply honest. It acknowledges that suffering has no plan, that love has no guarantee, and that meaning must be built, not found. And yet, in that fragile construction lies something profoundly human. Because when you stop expecting the universe to care, you begin to mean more. You realize that every act of kindness, every pursuit of truth, every small creation of beauty is an act of defiance against indifference. That's where purpose lives, not in divine reward, but in conscious participation. You see this everywhere once you start looking. In scientists spending their lives studying stars that will never know their names. In doctors healing strangers they'll never meet again. In artists painting visions that might be forgotten but still matter in the moment of creation. These aren't gestures toward heaven, they're affirmations of life. Religion once claimed that without God we would lose meaning, but the opposite is true. Without the illusion of divine safety nets, our choices gain weight. Love becomes braver when eternity isn't promised. Justice becomes more urgent when time is finite. Belief in gods once made people think their lives mattered because they were part of a grand design. The truth is, they matter because they are not, because meaning created in a meaningless universe is the rarest kind. It's deliberate, chosen, earned. Even death changes its shape under this light. Instead of being a doorway to another world, it becomes the closing of this one. And that makes every experience more sacred. The finality gives life its intensity. You don't need eternity to make a moment matter. You just need awareness. And awareness, fleeting as it is miraculous enough. Think about it. In all the vast coldness of space, matter arranged itself briefly into minds that can feel wonder, that can ask questions about their own existence. That's not a divine miracle, it's a natural one. And it's more impressive for being undesigned. Polytheism gave us art, monotheism gave us order, atheism gives us understanding. Each phase built on the last, even as it contradicted it. The world grew larger, the gods smaller, until finally we realized the gods were never the point. We were, because if meaning is to exist at all, it can only exist through us, through the conscious creatures capable of experiencing it. When we laugh, love, create, and think, we are the universe becoming aware of itself, not through divine revelation, but through evolution and chance. That's the deepest poetry there is, the kind that doesn't need belief to move you, the kind that doesn't require faith to feel awe. The night sky doesn't need a story to be beautiful, it just is, and so are we. The challenge is learning to live without illusions, not as cynics, but as caretakers of truth, to see clearly without despairing, to act kindly without reward, to cherish life without pretending it's permanent. That's not easy, but it's real, and the real is enough. When people finally let go of gods, what's left isn't emptiness, it's everything. The same mountains, the same oceans, the same faces of those we love, only now they belong fully to this world, not borrowed from another. So the conversation between monotheism, polytheism, and atheism isn't really about gods at all. It's about how we face reality, with fear, with imagination, or with understanding. Humanity began with fear, found beauty in imagination, and is still learning the courage of understanding. Maybe that's the final stage. Was it not disbelief, but clarity? Not rejection, but acceptance. The moment when we stop asking the universe to care and start caring for it ourselves. Because once you realize that the cosmos isn't watching, the only eyes that can bring meaning to it are your own. And that might be the most sacred truth of all.